Hey, welcome to today's History Brief. So this is the first of a three-part series on IU and the Civil War. So this presentation started a few years back when I got asked by our local Wiley House Museum and then our local Civil War Roundtable to share what I knew about IU and the Civil War. And then that kind of rolled into some research and then rolled into a presentation for the bicentennial that I've done around the state about IU and the Civil War. And so this is a current version of it that we're going to put online in a three-part series so that everybody will have the chance to check it out and learn a little bit more about IU history and how we were involved in the Civil War. So much of what we know about IU in the 1800s comes from kind of two primary sources. So the first was a history of IU that was written in 1890 by Theophilus Wiley. He's the guy on the left in this slide. Theophilus Wiley had been a professor at IU since the 1830s. He was the cousin of Andrew Wiley, the first president of the university, and had been very involved, very committed to the university throughout his time, and his retirement project was sort of this history of IU that included biographies of alumni and faculty members. And so they're short blurbs in his 1890 history on all of the students and what they did in the war, what their individual roles were, if he was able to get in touch with them or able to track them down. And so there's some gaps in that, but it was a fairly thorough work. The other source that we have is the work of Judge David Banta, and so he was a faculty member at IU and dean of the law school. And in the 1890s, he began researching IU history and giving a series of annual presentations on kind of the broader general history of IU that continued for quite a number of years. Those were later published around in the early 1900s, and so we have those as a source as well. And of course, our other primary source is the Golden Book. So the Golden Book was a list that was started in the 1890s by the Indiana Daily Student of all the students who had served in the Wars of the Republic. And that list includes gold stars and blue stars being those that served, gold stars being those who died in service. The Blue Star pages, as you can see here, doesn't really give us a lot of information about the individual, simply their name and their year that they graduated. Doesn't even tell us what sort of role they had in the war or even if they were Union or Confederate. The Gold Star pages, though, those who died in the war, we do get a little bit of biographical information about them, generally including what unit they were in, what side they served on, and as sometimes you can see with like Lucian Greathouse and Theodore Reed, we get a fair amount more biographical information about them and what their service was like, what their life was like sometimes as well. And as some of you may know, the Golden Book is quite a repository of resources, goes all the way up through World War II. We have an online version now for World War II on. We've databased those names. They're available electronically. We have a whole separate video all about the Golden Book as well. If you want to dig a little bit more into this really early IU history, I suggest you check out our other videos. We've got one on the Memorial Room, which includes the Golden Book. That's back from before I knew how to choose a frame where I didn't have my mouth open in the screen cap picture. That was an early video that we did. We also have some more recent ones on the Frontier College, why IU was placed in Bloomington, and some of the conditions in the early Antebellum that led to that. And then about David Maxwell, the founder of IU, who was also a veteran of the War of 1812, who we're going to touch on here in just a second. So the area of southern Indiana where Monroe County is located today came to the U.S. government via a treaty of 1809 with a number of Native American tribes. That, as you can see by the map, even by 1816, 1818, what we know of today as Monroe County still partially belongs to Native American tribes that are in the area, particularly the Potawatomi. There's a number of references to them being in the area in that early history. And so when Bloomington is chosen, and Perry Township in particular, as the home of Indiana University, and the land is given for that, this is really a frontier. This is a school on the frontier. And that lends itself to veteran and military involvement during that period, because much of the early settler period is pushed via the military, partially because of wars with Native Americans and other things that are happening, but also because of land grants given to veterans on behalf of the government for having served in the military. So the Clark grant for down in Clark County near IU Southeast, that's a military benefit that is given to Clark after the war. So these are things that are going on that are kind of pushing this boundary and puts IU on a frontier at the time that it's founded. So David Maxwell, the founding father of Indiana University, had been a surgeon in the War of 1812. And during that war, he had served in his brother-in-law's company, Williamson Dunn. And so Maxwell had married into the Dunn family. The Dunn family had a long history of military service, frontier service, dating the Revolution, the War of 1812, all the way through the Civil War, continues actually to this day. They have a long history of that service. So he marries into that, and all of our Dunn stuff on campus, of course, is named for that same Dunn family. So these are names that you hear quite a lot around campus. So early on in Indiana, when schools are first being thought of, Vincennes University is actually the first attempt at a university in the state of Indiana. William Henry Harrison, who was territorial governor, insists that military training needed to be a part of that curriculum. And this is around the time that West Point and what we know today as Norwich University are being founded. The idea of military academies are fairly common. Now, by 1840, when many of the veterans and the people who were involved in the founding of the university, they're expanding the university, they hire a mathematics professor named Jacob Ammon. And Jacob Ammon had been a faculty member at West Point. He'd been an Army officer. They hire him to come in to teach mathematics, and they ask him if while he's here, he would be willing to teach military science as well. And if you want to know more about kind of what military science meant at that time, I suggest you go watch our series on the history of ROTC at Indiana University. That's also a 3-part series, but you'll learn a little more about that. But so in 1840, Jacob Ammon becomes the professor of mathematics and the first professor of military science. So you have this students that are learning this as basics of their curriculum, these principles of military science and military organization and drill, and that would go on to serve them later on when they become officers and leaders in the Civil War. Jacob Ammon himself would go on to be a brigadier general during the Civil War, and his legacy still lives on today with the cannon that ROTC uses and fires off at football games when we score a touchdown. That cannon is named after Jacob Ammon. It's known as Big Jake. So one of the other things that happens early in IU history in the 1840s is the Mexican-American War. And the Mexican-American War is often seen as a training ground for many of the officers that would become leaders during the Civil War. And for IU, that is no different. So we had 3 veterans of the Mexican-American War who came to IU in 1848 and enrolled in the law school and graduated in 1850. One of those was Robert H. Milroy. And Milroy would go on to be a major general, that's a 2-star general, in the Civil War after having been a captain in the Mexican-American War. Now he did his undergraduate work at Norwich University, but was originally from Salem, Indiana, had gone to Norwich and gotten his bachelor's degree, and then came here for law school. Even though law school didn't require a bachelor's degree back then, he came here for law school and graduated. Now, during the Civil War, Milroy would go on to have 3 horses shot out from underneath him and only lost 1 battle while he was in command. He was very beloved by his men. At 6'10" tall, they nicknamed him the Gray Eagle, and he would go on to have that moniker and nickname throughout the rest of the war. And so Milroy was here as a student veteran, 1848 to 1850. It's important to understand the geography and the people movement of this time period. And so this is a chart of the students between 1825 and 1861. And of the 324 or 342, which was, so there were a little over 1,600 students at IU from 1825 to 1861. Of those, 342 were not from Indiana. 219 of them were from what would become Confederate or border states. And so if you look at this chart, you can see the red lines are antebellum. So before the war, about 5% of our students come from other Midwest states, about 8.3% from border states, and 5% from Confederate states. Now that shifts after the war. You see Confederate states drop to just 1%, border states to 3.8. Now some of this is driven by the fact that during and after the war, the Midwest states, particularly Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, places like that, really have an influx of population, including Indiana. But you can see here that we did get a lot of students from the South and from border states, partially because the primary source of travel during that time was the river. So when you think about Indiana and you think about where folks are coming from and how Indiana was settled, you have to remember Indiana was settled largely from south to north. So the earliest settlers to Indiana really settled in these southern portions, and they came from North Carolina, Virginia. Virginia actually had laid claim to Indiana at one point before it became the Northwest Territory, but it pushed people through Kentucky and up into Indiana. West Virginia via the Ohio River. We had many of our early settlers were from in southern Indiana, were from the border in the southern states. So that would become a factor in the politics and how the politics would later play out. And then during the antebellum period, you get the National Road. And when the National Road comes through, you start seeing many more settlers from Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York. You start seeing more northern settlers that are coming across and settling in Indiana. And so those settlers create a new area along the National Road that they're beginning to settle in. And this comes to define the politics of the area where those folks see themselves as true Northerners, and the folks in the red areas in southern Indiana as might as well be Kentucky. So, you may see that play out in Indiana today, where people in central Indiana will refer to Kentuckiana, or make jokes about rural southern Indiana. Some of that is still driven by this history of the culture difference that came between these two groups. It's also important to note that river travel was the primary means of travel before the Civil War. Railroads in southern Indiana in particular were just starting to become a thing in the antebellum period. The National Road had just become a thing, but primary travel was still the river. And so if you lived in the South, if you lived in Kentucky or Tennessee or down the Mississippi River, and you wanted to get back to schools back east and you wanted to go to college, then you came up the Mississippi and across the Ohio. And very often, the first large school, the first known school, the first big reputable public institution you'd find was Indiana University. Or that was within distance of the river in order to get to. And so that led to a number of Southerners from Mississippi, from Louisiana, from Kentucky, Tennessee, that made their way up to IU because that flow was happening. Now, that wasn't just true of students, that was also true of faculty members. As faculty members followed these roads and made their ways to different universities, those things happened as well. One such faculty member was Ebenezer Elliott. And so Elliott had lived in Kentucky and had gone to Miami University of Ohio, and had then become a faculty member, taught mathematics at IU for a few years in the 1830s. before he followed that river south and took a series of jobs in Mississippi, including a president of Mississippi College and a number of schools that were probably more like high schools than colleges, which was pretty common in the antebellum period, that they might have college names, but they were really more of a high school. And Elliott's primary academic contribution, and what he is the only thing he's actually still known for today, is he edited a book called Cotton is King and Pro-Slavery Arguments. And so this was the seminal academic publication justifying slavery. He wrote a chapter, besides the introduction and conclusion, he wrote a chapter himself that was supposed to be on the international laws of slavery. It's pretty heavy on racism and pretty light on laws, but it's out there. There's copies of it in the IU library if you ever want to check one out. It's also old enough that it's publicly available on a number of websites, and is still studied for studies of the time period or African American and African diaspora studies today. It is still referenced and used. To understand a little bit about where this Southern influence also came from, particularly from Virginia, you have to understand the Wise family. So Henry Wise had studied under Andrew Wiley when he was a president of a college in Pennsylvania. And he insisted that all of his children and his nephews and his extended family also study under Andrew Wiley, which meant that he was sending a number of the Wise family members and other people from the upper crust of Virginia society to Indiana University throughout the antebellum period to study. So much so, in fact, that the class of 1850, a quarter of them were Southerners and a third of them were Wise family members in the class of 1850. And so Obadiah Jennings Wise, who was Henry Wise's son, also known as Obie, wrote quite a bit to his family, and many of those letters were preserved. And so we get some understanding of what life was like at IU during this period. And a couple of my favorite letters from him that he wrote home in May of 1849, he writes home that the chief objection I have to this town is that the people are so extremely bigoted against dancing. Last winter, when we had dances here, we always had to go out in the country for girls. As to get one of the town ladies to shake her foot, that was decidedly out of the question. The Presbyterians declared that it was wicked, the Baptists that it was awful, and the good Methodist brethren denounced our ballroom for a young hell, that the fiddler was the devil himself, and that every dancer was an imp. So, you know, he had a lot of complaints about the lack of social life that was kind of happening here. July 24th of 1850, he writes home that our final exam took place on the 14th. I was very unwell the night before, and Dr. Wiley came to me the next morning and told me not to go down. However, as soon as I got the old doctor out of the way, I braced myself with a large dose of opium, which enabled me to get through the whole 6 hours examination. Obie would go on after he graduated to serve with the State Department and serve at the embassy in Berlin and Paris and be a part of our delegations there. He had several controversies, let's call them that, with the married wives of other ambassadors and staff members. That resulted in him being sent back from overseas. He later on at one point says that, you know, most of what he saw of Germany was seen through the bottom of a beer glass. And his inventory of things that he brought back from Europe included several hundred cases of wine. So he did like to party quite a bit. When he returns from Europe, he takes a job as the editor of the Richmond Enquirer, position his father likely helped him get. And when John Brown has his raid on Harper's Ferry, Obie is actually reporting from the scene for the newspaper, but also for his father. So he's sending messages back to his father about what's happening. Of course, Henry Wise was governor of Virginia at that point, and is the one who had John Brown executed. So we have, you know, firsthand on the scene accounts that are coming from him. Obie would go on to serve in the Civil War as a captain with the Richmond Light Blues. They were only in one battle in the entire Civil War, the Battle of Roanoke Island, at which Obie was one of, I think, 2 casualties that happened during the war. And so that's the story of Obadiah Jennings Wise, who probably has one of the better hats of the period. Now, it was during this same time period, this 1850s time period, that the university becomes very involved with the Owen family. And so those that know your Indiana history, New Harmony, Indiana, the New Harmony experiment, that is Robert Owen, and his sons would go on to be very involved in IU. So Robert Dale Owen was a member of the Board of Trustees and involved in state politics in the 1840s and 1850s. And then two of Robert Dale Owen's brothers would go on to be faculty members at the university, one of which was Colonel Richard Owen. And so Richard Owen had served in the Spanish-American or the Mexican-American War, and was a geologist by training, and did a lot of scientific work with his brother, who was a state geologist for Indiana. And Richard Owen would go on to be a faculty member at IU. He would leave to go serve in the Civil War, and would later return to IU. And Richard Owen, Owen family in general, the 2 things they were most known for was a very liberal interpretation of Christianity that was often seen as being atheist by most folks. And secondly, that they were abolitionists. So if you think about the time frame of the 1850s, you have these Southern students and these Southern faculty members, you have these Northern abolitionist students, Northern abolitionist faculty members, and they're mixing together on the IU campus in a way that maybe we don't always sort of understand or appreciate. And if you read a lot of the work of the time, the graduation addresses, the literature debates, those sort of things, you can see this sort of play out occasionally where, they're talking about, the issues of slavery, and they're talking about some of these things on campus. And so I can only imagine what the private conversations were like if, you're just seeing the tip of it in the public conversations. So Richard Owen would go on to be a colonel in the Civil War. He is best known actually for his treatment of prisoners. And so he was briefly the commandant of the Camp Morton prison camp at Indianapolis. And he set a lot of standards for that camp that were not common for their day. So he did things like he allowed the sergeants, the NCOs, the Confederate sergeants, to manage discipline and manage kind of day-to-day operations in the camp. He allowed them out on small work programs so they could go earn money in the community so they could have better food. He thought they should have blankets because it's cold in Indiana and they might need blankets. All of these sort of humane treatment of prisoners that were not common during the Civil War would later become part of the laws of war, but not until the 1930s. So really, he's way ahead of his time in this thinking, so much so that later on in the war, he actually gets captured by Southerners. Simon Bolivar Buckner ends up capturing his unit. And Buckner calls him in and says, hey, we've heard about how you treat prisoners and how professional and nice and caring you've been about that. So as such, I'm going to parole your unit, which means we're going to release them and let them go home after we take their weapons, of course. But we're going to allow you to keep your personal weapons as the commander, as a show of gratitude and thank you. For that. And so he paroled Owen and sent him and his unit home. So after the war, those Confederate prisoners got together and started talking about, and they comparing notes with other people that had been prisoners during the war. They talked about how horrible it was in prison camps. And they said, wow, we really didn't have it that bad. And they sort of realized how good they had it. And so those former Confederates hired a daughter of a Confederate officer to give a to make and create and give a statue to the state of Indiana honoring Richard Owen. And so the original of that statue is in the State House up in Indianapolis, but the state of Indiana later gave a copy of it to Indiana University and Purdue University because Richard Owen was also the first president of Purdue University. Now, for my Purdue fans, just so you know, never actually set foot on the campus, never actually taught there. As soon as he was helping form the university, as soon as it was ready to start, he decided to not leave IU and he wanted to stay here, so he resigned from the presidency. So yes, the first president of Purdue was an IU faculty member. Just remember that. Not that there's any rivalry, just letting you know. But you'll see copies of the Owen statue in the Indiana Memorial Union near the memorial room in the entryway to the building. And then there's a copy in the Student Union at Purdue as well. At least that's where it was last time I checked. I'm assuming it's still there. All right, so that's going to wrap up our first part. We have gotten all the way up to secession. We haven't gotten there yet. We covered that kind of antebellum and that mix of North and South that's kind of occurring in southern Indiana. And what's the impacts on IU? What kind of happens from there? That's going to be in our next section. So in part 2, we're going to talk about the Civil War, the actual time period of the Civil War. And then in the third part, we're going to talk about what happens after the Civil War and kind of the Civil War impacts on IU. So part 1 is done. I'm going to throw a subscribe button on here, and I'm going to put a link to some of our other videos if you want to check any of those out, probably one of them that we talked about at some point during this. And hopefully you'll go on to watch part 2, and we'll see you then.